We're happy to have David Ball, formerly the Tyee and now a reporter with Star Vancouver. He's going to join us as the moderator for the next panel. Come on up, David, and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This is actually my second or third civic governance forum. As David mentioned, I was at the Tyee before covering housing, so this was always a place where I could find lots of ideas, and we were always looking for solutions. So I'm hoping that this panel can actually get towards that and a little bit less time on the formalities of introductions and stuff and more on what people are actually doing or want to do or have questions for the minister or for you. But the idea, I think, is to be inspiring and to find solutions. So I'm at the Star of Vancouver now. I'm a politics reporter, but I have a big heart for housing and policy. And seated next to me, we have Tom. He's the executive director, of course, of the Cooperative Housing Federation of BC, and also Community Land Trust Foundation, which is doing some pretty amazing and ambitious stuff in Vancouver. Selena Robinson needs no introduction, but she's here. Thank you. That was a surprise at the last minute. We'll get to grill you. Christine went over, a newly elected councillor on City of Vancouver for the One City, and a longtime climate justice activist, and you might have not known an ordained minister as well. So she'll be preaching it here today. And Chuck Bookmeyer, the city councillor for the City of New Westminster, no stranger to this forum, and also a retired member of the legislature, so we'll have another provincial experience here since so much of this overlaps. And finally, Brad West with the City of Port Coquitlam, the mayor elected last year and a longtime councillor there. Also recently completed a program in leadership at Harvard, and I know him more recently as one of the outspoken people calling for a public inquiry on money laundering, but we can talk about that later.
Sure, absolutely.
Anyways, I wanted to open by maybe asking people just to introduce yourself in relation to the kind of work that you are doing or want to do on housing. And then after that, we can maybe kind of respond to Minister Robinson's comments there or anything else that's come up in the forum so far. Sound good? And I'll be cutting you off when the times run out. But I'll pass it. We'll go around this way first. So, Tom, if you don't mind starting.
Happy to. Thank you very much. I'm so pleased to be here for a second year. And I'm especially excited to be working with a minister who's not afraid to say publicly that her strategy for more affordable housing in BC includes new housing co-ops. We haven't heard that for 2 decades. So thank you for that. But I'm here representing more than just the Co-op Housing Federation. The community housing sector is now a strategic alliance of co-ops and nonprofits, and we account for more than 75,000 permanently affordable homes here in the province. And what we've seen in the last 3 to 4 years is the emergence of the community housing sector as a player in the development of new homes. I took note of some of the references earlier on in the questions that were part of the research about how we feel about developers and how the extent to which we need to rely on the development sector to produce a supply of affordable housing. And the point I want to make is that the development industry now includes social purpose real estate developers who don't pay attention only to the bottom line, but pay attention to social mission that includes sharing the goals that the current government has. And our Community Land Trust is now poised to deliver in the pipeline now close to 2,000 new affordable homes between now and 2021, homes that will be permanently affordable on land held in perpetuity by a nonprofit community land trust. So those homes are now being created in what one reporter called speculation-free zones to take that housing out of the marketplace so that the value can't be increased and siphoned off to pad someone else's balance sheet, but is devoted solely to the job of affordable homes in perpetuity. And this is something that I mention now because the partnerships that are emerging between municipalities and the Community Land Trust, to me, represents enormous promise. We're working now actively on new affordable developments with the cities in Vancouver, Surrey, North Cowichan, Coquitlam, and others stepping up, saying to the Community Land Trust, we have land, we have the goal of developing affordable housing. We want to do it in a way that produces homes for a broad range of incomes, a broad range of family types, And the sector is now able to operate at a scale that actually enables it to meet municipalities halfway toward those goals and to become real partners in developing affordable homes, as I said, in perpetuity, not just for the short term of an affordability agreement that may be reached with a private sector developer. So that's what we're up to these days, and we're very pleased to be partnering very actively with the province, with a number of municipalities, and even the federal government, which is recently back at the table. And it's a good day to be involved in the housing sector in BC.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you to the Columbia Institute for this amazing program every year. A little bit, I just want to really quickly give you a history lesson about what you can do in a local government. 20 years ago, New Westminster, it was not what New Westminster was today. We started to look at some affordable housing for people suffering from mental illness. And we converted an old building that had so many police calls almost daily, and we converted it into a housing facility with zero opposition in the community. About 10 years later, we did two more projects, the Rhoda Kalis place and the Russell Housing. The Rhoda Kalis we preserved, or the Russell Housing, we preserved a heritage site. It used to be a hotel. It used to have an average of one police call a day. It had more police calls than all our other drinking establishments combined. So when the council of the day decided to engage the public in changing that, again, the public hearing had zero opposition to this. The city today has numerous affordable housing providers, virtually all of them with no opposition. We have 3 parole facilities, 3 heritage houses that were turned into a parole facility for Genesis House. Halfway houses. They are absolutely seamless in the community. People don't even realize that they're there. Recently, we had a public hearing in Queensborough to create some modular housing. And that's when NIMBYism started to rear its ugly head. And NIMBYism can paralyze the city council. Political opportunists take advantage of it. People that want to run in the next election, they will embrace the groups. They will terrify the groups. They will give them misinformation. And we actually saw that attempted in the Queensborough area. Council did the right thing, kept an open mind, listened to all the people that came towards council and spoke in favor and in opposition, and we ended up passing the resolution to support it. In Queensborough also, we have housing for women fleeing violence. We have housing for children aging out of government care, foster children. So, while the city engaged in all of this, modernizing and compassionate housing, our police force hasn't grown. In 20 years, we have the same number of police officers. We have 2 officers that are mental health specialists, and the mental health specialists train other officers to approach people properly when it comes to issues of mental health. So we can show that you can work together. The question was originally was, what can local governments do? So the province thankfully brought in inclusionary zoning. We're involved in that. We're going to zone areas for rental only, family rental only. We have a moratorium on stratifying rental properties. Our OCP we just completed. We did our OCP through the lens of affordable housing, so that we created affordable housing. We have some surplus lands that we have given up to nonprofits working with BC Housing to build affordable housing on 60-year lease terms. And so there is a lot that local government can do. There is more that we can do now under this government. The iron is hot. I'm telling all the nonprofit people I know, get your work together, get your proposals into the government. Now's the time to strike and start providing the social housing. We're at war here. This is a crisis. This is an absolute crisis. And the only solution is you need to be fairly aggressive as a local government. You need to push your colleagues that may not want to go forward with this. You have to take some actions that may push the envelope. We just did a renoviction bylaw, and Port Coquitlam did as well. Other local governments are starting to look at that. You may end up in court here and there, but we feel that it's defensible. This is a war. Come armed, but don't bring pillows. So let's work together on this. Thanks.
My name is Christine Boyle. I'm a first-time counselor in Vancouver and a past staff of the Columbia Institute. So I was on staff here when Minister Robinson was here as a locally elected counselor, and some of you were here then too. Happy to be in this seat now. I just want to name, as we're starting, my friend and colleague Salem, who's an elected Squamish leader, was going to be on the panel with us today and got stuck in Ottawa. And I get to work with him quite a bit on housing policy. And he's been leading and involved in some great work in the Squamish Nation. So sorry that his voice isn't here, but he'll be here tomorrow and worth picking his brain. And I, in part, just want to name that because I try to not be on all white panels. As an organizer, I try not to organize them too, and I know the Columbia Institute and the folks organizing had a strong commitment to making sure that there was diversity of voices in who was involved, who was speaking, who we were hearing from, and that's also on me and on us in terms of what we say yes to. I think there's kind of a tendency of like, this is such a great opportunity for me, or my voice is so unique and important that I should definitely be there. And there are folks in all of our communities that we could be passing that chance on to. So I'm just calling myself out on that, but also the rest of us here to take on a bit of that work. So I ran in this election with a pretty young, sassy team of organizers. And we ran in part in terms of housing on a campaign to basically abolish single-family housing, or zoning at least. We ran on this platform of every neighborhood for everyone, that we should have affordable housing and supportive housing in every neighborhood of our city, that there should be no exclusively zoned parts of our city where you have to be wealthy enough to live there. And we have a history of that exclusionary zoning being actually really racially based, explicitly racist in that zoning. So it's been part of our work to name and challenge that history and shift the conversation. And it's not easy, and it will continue to not be easy. But that's a big focus for me, is how we shape the future of the city in terms of equity, in terms of density, and in terms of affordability, so that more folks have a chance to find homes in all parts of our city. So we've been working on that, and I've been working on that in a number of ways. And one is having our staff at the City of Vancouver explore what it would look like for Vancouver to implement a land value tax. So as you know, one of our key tools as local governments is zoning and public investment in amenities and facilities, and we create land value in using those tools. And so we want to figure out how that value that we create can continue circling back into public priorities rather than going toward individual landowners. We have a lot of things that we would like to be spending that money on. We have a lot of needs, and so how can we be ensuring that the land lift that we create continues to fund those needs? We've been doing some work on tenant protection, though we have a lot more work that we need to do on that, and I'm sure that'll be some of our conversation. Vancouver is going into a citywide planning process, so a lot of this conversation about equity and density will be part of that conversation, and in particular, a priority for me is making sure that that conversation is reaching folks who aren't the usual suspects in terms of who we're hearing from, so that the outcome of the city plan really reflects all of the residents of Vancouver and not just those who know how to participate and speak up in it. And then another project of mine is working on our co-op. We have a lot of co-ops whose leases are running out, and so that's a thing to work on, and that matters to me. And I will wrap up there, and we'll get to talk more.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. Just want to tell a bit of a story, and it really picks up on what Minister Robinson talked about what you can accomplish when you have political will. I was barely 100 days into being mayor when I had a phone call from a gentleman, a retired gentleman, a senior citizen in Port Coquitlam, who I had actually known quite well through various political campaigns. He always volunteers on Mike Farnworth's campaign, and we got to know each other through that. And he told me that he had had an eviction notice slipped under the door of his apartment at 1955 Western Drive. And he read his eviction notice to me, and it said he had to be evicted for renovations to his sliding glass door and to his balcony. The only problem is he doesn't have a balcony. So he thought, well, this must be a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. We found out in very short order that the 100 tenants of 1955 Western Drive had all been given eviction notices. And the new owner who had purchased the building about 6 months ago was going to do what they had done in community after community throughout Metro Vancouver and throw these people out, make cosmetic improvements to their units, and to, of course, invite them back, but at double the rent. Now, 1955 Western Drive is an interesting building. It's about 50 years old. It's exceptionally well maintained. The city has all of the building permits going back 5 decades of all the work that had been done to the building. So it had been maintained, it had been improved, it had been renovated over those 50 years. And if you can imagine it, the previous owner was able to do that without evicting a single person. But apparently for this new owner, it was impossible. So the issue found its way to council in very short order, and I'm very proud to say that council unanimously and immediately said to our staff, we can't let this stand. We have to take action. And our staff, we were fortunate to be able to work very closely with the staff at the City of New Westminster and put in front of our council a renoviction bylaw. And it was an amendment to our business bylaw that put in a number of regulations to stop that renoviction dead in its tracks. We had a public input session just last Tuesday, which is, in my 10 years on Port Coquitlam City Council, the most compelling public meeting that I have ever been involved in. You had an incredible mix of new immigrants to the country with longtime tenants, seniors, people on disability, working class people, young people, all come out and speak at that public input opportunity and tell their story and talk about how if they were evicted, they had nowhere to go. And Port Coquitlam was their home. And as Chuck says, sometimes you need to push the envelope. And I knew that we were pushing the envelope, and quite frankly, and the elected officials in the room will understand this, we had to push our staff hard. Because in Port Coquitlam, we're a smaller municipality. We tend to like to be second or third or fourth or fifth or sixth or seventh or eighth or ninth or 10th to do something, not first or second. It was outside of staff's comfort zone, but we had to push them, and we did as a council, and we pushed them, and we pushed ourselves. And I'm just so proud that our council took the action that it did and stopped that renoviction. And what I think is really important about that, and this will be my challenge to all of you in this room who are city councillors or mayors, we stopped renovictions in Port Coquitlam not after 100 people have been renovicted, not after 500 people have been renovicted, not after 1,000 people had been renovicted, but before one person got renovicted. And in too many cities in Metro Vancouver, this has happened over and over again. It is a predatory bullshit practice and is all about greed. That's what some of these predatory developers, and I have to say, it's not the majority of them, but there are a few. And that's their business model. They told me. I had a meeting with the developer, and I said, this isn't going to fly in Port Coquitlam. They said, well, this is our business model. So my challenge is, to those of you who are in a position to do something about it, do something. We can't call ourselves progressives because we support building bike lanes, but then sit on our hands while thousands of working class people get tossed out of their homes. So if you're interested in what we've done, you think that your city should look at doing something similar, I'd be happy to talk to you over the next period of time that we have together. Email me. I know City of New Westminster was wonderful in terms of their staff just helping our staff through the process. But at the end of the day, it does take political will and leadership to get it done, and it's up to those of us in this room to do that.
Thanks very much, Mayor West, and nice bike lane burn as a Vancouverite.
I'm from Poco, I gotta do it.
Also, great to add to the level of swearing in the session. I think it's putting everyone at ease. Keep it up, we can all handle it. So just keeping in mind that this panel is kind of looking at a lot of these questions and thorny challenges that have come up, things around zoning and bylaws and the vital role that cities can play in actually leveraging housing stock and housing protection. I wanted to add a few things to that from what people have said, namely some of the links between equity and density, around tenant protection, around maintaining existing stock. We've heard about co-ops, we've heard about rental losses, and so I just wanted to kind of flag those. And I have a few questions prepared, but I wanted to draw your attention to these cards on your table. Some are pink, some are green at the center. They're for you to ask questions, and over the course of the next half hour, we'll be collecting them up and bringing them here so I can ask them to the panelists. So if there's something specific you want to know more about, or a challenge you're having in your community that you don't know how to address, or would like to hear a little bit of detail on how others have solved it or are trying to solve it, write them down here in neat writing, and somebody will go through them and bring them up to me. All right, so the first question while people are filling out their little pieces of paper is going to be for everyone or whoever wants to answer, and that's how municipalities can work best with the community housing sector, and in particular to protect and expand supply. And in addition, if there's any concerns or emerging challenges in that area that you kind of see on the horizon that we could be mindful of. So would anyone like to tackle that?
Well, I'm pretty happy you asked that question. I don't think I'm going to do that well on the swearing front here because all of my favorite words have already been taken. So
we share. We're good progressives.
Oh, do we? All right. So let's talk about an emerging issue that I think is going to be vital in the next little while, and it concerns the disposition of land. So, and I hear this from staff in Vancouver and Burnaby and some of the other municipalities. Because the targets that have been set, quite rightly so, by the province are so ambitious, so aggressive. Developer, and I'm not one to demonize private developers. Every stick of social housing in Canada was built by a private sector developer contractor. So it's not a question of who gets to play in the system. It's a question of who owns the assets at the end of the day. And the developers are now circling and approaching city staff in, as I said, in Vancouver, Burnaby, and elsewhere, very aggressively to say, if you want to meet the targets that have been set for affordable housing in your community, you need to give us your land or sell us your land at a discounted price, and we will build that supply. But we need the value of the asset on our balance sheets to borrow against downstream. Now, we've seen this movie before. Everyone likes to wax nostalgic these days about the tax expenditure programs in the 70s and 80s, you know, the MERBs, the ARPs, the CRISPs. And those were programs that were wildly successful in introducing a new supply of rental housing into the marketplace that desperately needed it. But the challenge I would issue to any of you is go and find one of those projects today. one of those housing developments. They've been flipped 40 times. There's the odd building you can find that was developed under the MERB program owned by a mom-and-pop landlord. But by and large, they've now been sequestered on the balance sheets of private sector developers and corporations, and the affordability has been lost. The ability to generate community benefit from them has been lost because the original decision to divest the asset made by a municipality squandered the legacy of that asset. So I would say to any municipality, if you own assets in land, those assets are a critical component in partnering with the community housing sector to generate long-term, permanent affordability. Do not sell or do not give away that asset in land to the private sector. Use community assets to build community wealth. And if you don't do that, then you'll have squandered the legacy that you quite possibly could create. And if governments, and I'd say this to the minister, if the provincial or the federal government allow the guidelines in their housing programs to allow that to happen, then we'll all have been complicit in the greatest land theft in Canadian history. So let's keep in mind where those community assets sit now, and let's not make the mistake of letting them slip out of the community realm.
Thank you. And by not swearing so much, he in fact stayed right within the time limit I was about to mention of stick to a couple minutes. So thank you.
So I just want to talk about one of the initiatives that we're looking at, and we've seen some of these throughout the Metro Vancouver area, especially in Vancouver, and that's partnering. So you're creating a future land asset in a building with a new developer, and you're partnering with a nonprofit, and you're partnering with BC Housing. And so you could build 30, 40 units, and in exchange you're allowing some density so that there's a benefit to that developer to get some extra density. The nonprofit, because they rely on income to sustain the rents, especially when they're below market rents, they gladly come to the table for those kinds of partnerships. So here you're creating a future legacy of housing. You're locking it in with a partnership with a private developer by exchanging some densities and keeping it out of the ability of that developer for forever, in perpetuity, so that they're not able to liquidate that asset. It remains in control of the nonprofit covenanted. So that's just one of the pieces. So I'll leave it on that one. Was there someone else talking on this one, though?
I just want to echo what Tom said. I think it's so important that we hold on to public assets as a public good and not be selling them off. And that's certainly it's a conversation that the Vancouver School Board wrestles with. So it's not just a conversation at the council table. And I think it couldn't be more important that we keep those public and. To the point of the greatest land theft in history, we exist on stolen land still in Vancouver, and so there's a vital importance for us to be partnering with Indigenous community land holders too, and ensuring. I mean, the displacement of Indigenous people still in Vancouver because of the housing crisis. Is horrific, and so making sure that we're partnering with those communities and with nations to build Indigenous housing as a community housing developer and as a social good and a public asset is hugely important too.
Yeah, I can just add another. It's a small thing, but it's a thing municipalities can do when you're looking at a housing project that delivers significant community value and affordable housing, which is they go to the front of the line of the housing projects and a number of city fees get waived. Those are things that you can do because I know for us, and I'm sure many cities, your staff have so many hours in a day, they have to have some way of prioritizing all those applications that are coming through the door and making sure those ones go to the top of the list. It's just something very simple, but it does have an impact.
Thank you. I have a question from the audience, the first one. Don't forget about your cards. You can fill them out. Get access to this fine expertise up here. So this is interesting. and I think pretty key to this because of the federal role in leaving housing in the 90s. But please comment on the role of federal housing initiatives with municipalities. And I thought maybe I'd start with Chuck, because you were in an MLA through 96 until 09, right? So you kind of watched this. Oh no, you're in council? You're in council 05 to 09. And so you kind of saw this unfolding directly.
Absolutely. 20 years ago, prior to that, the federal government got out of housing, and the government at the time in BC was still an NDP government, and they actually covered the loss and created to build affordable social housing. The last 16 years or 16 years after that, nothing from federal or provincial governments. That's why we're so far behind. You can't take that volume of housing and future housing out of the equation and not expect an absolute disaster on the bottom end. And we're seeing a changing face in homelessness. I work with a foundation as well that raises money for homelessness, and the people on the streets are changing. They're working poor. They're seniors. They're people that had very comfortable retirements up until a few years ago. And so the federal government absolutely has to get back into the game in a meaningful way, not just lip service or promises. They need to get back in and fund housing at a very, very serious and critical, and partner with the provincial government to do that.
Great. Anyone else want to tackle the federal? Maybe Minister Robinson, did you want to say something on that? Don't hold back. Say whatever you want about the federal government right now.
I've used up all my swear words for the day. Well, I do think it's important. I mean, we really need everybody at the table, and that includes the federal government. And it's nice that there's financing. It's nice that there's back-end loaded. But we need help today, not 5 years from now, not 8 years from now. And it really isn't an issue of financing. And so there are other tools that are available, I think, to the federal government that isn't available to us. And I have had some contact with the minister responsible, and I've actually talked to the premier around when he sees his new pal, JT, to bring him up to speed on what we need from his government. Which is we need some tools, some incentive tools to incent rental construction, and they have some levers at their disposal. And talk to your people to figure out what that is, and talk with us, and let's come up with something that will work. And the other one is they need to deliver on housing for Indigenous people across this nation. It is disgusting what has not happened, and I think that's a major piece that needs to happen, and they need to get to it. And I even pleaded, I said, just match us for what we've done, and I know what we can deliver, and it's not just plunking housing in. We are working with Indigenous communities. We've signed, recently, for example, we signed an MOU with 5 Indigenous communities in the Nicola Valley, and we're working with them to support them in their development of housing in their communities. This is them, their leadership, their support, making sure that they have what they need so that they have the capital, the human capital, and the capacity to do what they need to be done. So I was just in Upper Nicola, meeting with the chief there, and they took me out. It was a beautiful site on their land. And we're building, it's either 24 or 28, so don't hold me to the number, homes. They've had 3 homes built in the last decade on this reserve. They have a wait list of 100, and we're doing 20, it's either 24 or 28. And it's not enough. I know it's not enough. And we really need the feds to step up and deliver.
What are the unutilized levers? You said there's levers they can use.
Well, it's more the tax policy, and I'm not a minister of finance, and so I'm not familiar with sort of all the elements. But I do think, just because it's hard doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And I want to leave it up. They need to come up with some tax incentives, whether it's a new MURB of some kind, something that stimulates and makes it very attractive to build rental housing. Because we know that we are going to need it going forward. There's 1 million more people coming to the Lower Mainland over the next 25 years. Like, where are they going to live? I remember hearing a news story last year. We had just delivered our 30-point plan, and I think it was Amazon that was coming to Vancouver, and everyone was excited, and I had a pit in my stomach, thinking, where are these people going to live, and who are they going to displace? So we need to figure our way out of it, and we need the feds to be working with us to get there.
And of course, one of the things I realized as a housing reporter before was how, as CMHC got out of a lot of the housing market with the feds, the role of CMHC also got shrunk and shrunk and shrunk to a very small thing. So that's another potential lever. Any of the others want to get into this federal role and things that you'd need to see there or like to see?
I mean, the tax issue for me is simple. Just waive the GST on the development of new affordable housing. And while you're at it, waive the provincial property transfer tax. Because if you're a nonprofit developer moving land into a land trust to generate permanent affordability, you're paying GST, you're paying transfer tax. And that, because you don't have a 15 to 20% profit margin to squeeze, that's going straight to rents. So straight on to the monthly housing costs of people in the lowest income quintile in the province. So the tax issue for me could easily be solved as long as different levels of government stop waiting for the other level to be the first one to move on it. But since the minister won't brag about it, I will. In the absence of CMHC being creative and innovative on the financing side, BC Housing, Manitoba Housing, and the Housing Services Corporation of Ontario have incorporated what I would call a sector bank. It's the Housing Investment Corporation, and they are going into the capital markets and getting $200 million a tranche and then lending it back into the affordable housing sector. We committed a loan for a City of Vancouver development that we acquired on a 60-year lease last month for $23 million at a fixed rate for 40 years. At just under 4.2%. Now, that's a few basis points higher than you can get through the province's direct lending. But the first housing co-op I ever developed was in Saskatoon in 1982, and the takeout rate on the mortgage was 19.75%. And the debt service, I can tell you, the gap between economic and market rent, forget about affordable rent, just economic to market, on a 19.75 debt burden is astronomical. So locking in interest rates for 40 years de-risks a pro forma in ways that are completely profound. I made the first mortgage payment last week, and I said to myself, I'm making 479 more mortgage payments in exactly the same amount. My financial projections now provide security of tenure and affordability for those 135 households. So it's a game changer. So those kinds, imagine, just those are 3 provincial housing corporations generating a solution that solves a problem. Access to capital has been a bear for us for the last 2 decades. If the federal government could bring its enormous resources to bear in a similar way, the kinds of housing we could build, both in terms of supply and affordability, would produce numbers that would blow our minds. So now I'll just say that it's nice to be working with an NDP government on the housing crisis in BC, because there wouldn't be a co-op housing sector in Canada had it not been for David Lewis in 1972, who said to Pierre Trudeau, we'll support your minority government, but only if you build co-op and nonprofit housing across the country. And that's a legacy that we'll always be grateful for.
Thanks, Tom. Before we ask the other panelists, I wonder, Tom, since there's a lot of new faces in the civic world after the last election, could you give your elevator pitch for what is a land trust?
It's just simply a nonprofit organization that acquires and holds lands in perpetuity for affordable housing. It's hasn't always been for housing. The early land trusts in the States arose around the gentrification of racialized neighborhoods and the dispossession of whole communities. So they were really a human rights-based movement. Then they became a vehicle for habitat protection and the conservation or preservation of agricultural land, and then finally a tool for acquiring and preserving affordable housing. So in the Canadian community housing sector, land trusts are actively involved in developing new homes, redeveloping existing homes, which is an opportunity that we should also talk about within municipalities. If you have a stock of affordable co-op or nonprofit housing, the easier you can make it for those co-ops or nonprofit providers to redevelop properties that were built in the 80s or 90s at very low density levels, the bigger dent you can make in the supply and affordability crisis. But that's really what it is. It's organizations held by the community for community benefit in perpetuity.
Great. Long elevator ride, but very eloquent.
There's a tall building.
Yeah, we'll build more of those. Would either of you like to answer the federal question? No need? Okay. So my next question is about, in your communities, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that come up around discussions around housing, concerns from the community, and how are you approaching, challenging, considering them? And I guess part of that is the whole NIMBY versus YIMBY debate that everyone seems to have to be divided in these days. But it doesn't have to be restricted to that. What are some of the ways that you are actually working with some of these challenges? Maybe we'll start at the end with Brad, since we missed you in the last question.
Sure. There's a couple of things that come to mind. We just approved a project not that long ago on the north side of Port Coquitlam. It is a fairly innovative project, at least for us. It's a social housing project with women-headed leases. And it is going to be a place where women and their children are going to be able to be housed. One of the things that I thought was really consequential to its success was the early engagement with a community. Now, this was a piece of property that has been vacant for a long period of time, and at one point was zoned to be townhouse residential. It has had townhouse residential develop all around it, and so people have this certain expectation that that's what was going to be there. But when we had the opportunity as a city to partner with a nonprofit housing provider to address this need in the community, that early involvement in the neighborhood, I think really went a long way to dispel some of the myths. Most people in life don't like to be caught off guard by anything, or they don't like surprises. And in my time on council, I found that one of the accelerants to public opposition at public hearings and things like that is, I had no idea this was happening. There was no notice. I just found out, the classic comment we would always get at public hearing. I just found out about this yesterday. And sometimes that would cause council to panic and be like, oh, okay, we need to stop. But that early involvement in the neighborhood, I think, really went a long way, because it was one of our longer public hearings, but there was a lot of local neighborhood support. The project passed unanimously through council. The other part of your question about what is one of the misconceptions? One of the misconceptions I think I had for a long time on council, and it's one of the things that I'm still working at understanding, and I know our council is as well, and that is how much wealth is created by density. And I have to give a shout out to Paul Finch from the BCGU, because I went through a presentation with him and really started to understand that a lot of our planning department were preaching density just because, well, it's a good planning principle. And I understand that. The part that was missing is there's a hell of a lot of money and wealth that gets generated by that additional density, and being able to capture that through various means for the community is something that you can turn your attention to when you understand truly what's being created by it.
Thank you. Christine?
Yeah, I would echo that the public hearing process needs improvement, certainly in Vancouver, and I think more of that, having heard Nadine Nakagawa from New West talking about it. So That's one of the things in terms of controversies or tensions. And the other is this supply question. And I want to layer that a little bit because one of the debates that we're having this week in Vancouver is about the sort of validity and value of market rental housing. Market rental housing in Vancouver is very unaffordable to many renters in Vancouver, and also we need more rental for people across income levels. And I think one of the challenges, one of the things that makes for us this heated debate about secure rental housing so heated is the affordability question that we're not able currently to build much that's more affordable than new market rental. And so all of our supply debate gets focused on this one piece, and it gets kind of villainized because it's not solving the whole problem. And the challenge isn't that it's bad, I think. The challenge isn't that it's bad, but that it's not, it's just one tool in a toolbox, and we're missing a whole bunch of the other tools. And so we need to figure out how we can, at whatever level and in whatever partnership, also be building secure, stable rental housing for people who are making less than $50,000, less than $80,000 a year. The new market rental that we're building right now is for households with more than $80,000 in income, and that can't be our only solution. And I think if we were able to be figuring out how we're building homes for folks across the rest of that lower end of the income spectrum, then it would reduce some of the opposition that we're seeing in Vancouver to that one segment of market rental, because we would be meeting more people's needs. Right now, there's sometimes this sort of what feels to me like an awkward alliance of folks who hate new market rental because they don't want transient renters in their neighborhood, and folks who hate new market rental because it isn't low-income rental. And those folks get together and they shit on market rental and try to take down the program, and it's not getting us anywhere. It's not getting us further along. And also, those concerns that it's not meeting the needs of low-income people are real, and so we need to be addressing them, I think, so that we're building stronger coalitions of housing and tenant advocates together and not pitting them against one another.
One of the misconceptions, or one of the excuses that I sometimes hear from other communities is this isn't our job. We're municipal governments. Our job isn't to facilitate affordable housing. Our example is that it's actually a win-win. I agree. I believe senior levels of government have the highest responsibility for the issue. But having said that, local governments working with senior levels of government in providing that housing has huge benefits. We went, in our example, we went from a Columbia Street that was derelict. You could roll a bowling ball down there, you wouldn't hit anybody. In the morning, people were sleeping in doorways, and the council at the time, I was in Victoria at the time, but the local council were very bold and said, no, we're going to accept resources and we're going to create these facilities. We reduced street homelessness by 40% with those two projects. And what happened was that the people that were homeless, that were now being looked after in a wraparound way, were getting treatment, were moving decanted through the system of shelter, second stage, and eventually back to work and back to housing. So it wasn't creating a hummingbird feeder. People weren't just coming there because we had those services. People were rehabilitating through those services. The tax base in the city went up because people were now looking at Columbia Street and saying, wow, this is actually not a bad historic street. You know, there's no homeless people, the graffiti's gone, the eyes on the street, the homeless organizations clean up in the morning. They have groups that go out there and clean the streets. And so it did just the reverse. So the little bit that the city put in or lost by tax revenue from not being able to get the taxes on those buildings, we gained that in spades by elevating the rest of the downtown core, by making it a better place for businesses.
I guess the only people who complained would have been the people who wanted to go bowling on Columbia Street. Minister, maybe you'd like to ask a question in a couple minutes just about, answer the question. Sorry, I have a question for you to ask, but to answer the question also about misconceptions, because you obviously face that as well and have faced that before.
Well, it's certainly an ongoing challenge. We certainly had heard it in the Marpole community that there were voices that were being elevated around with misinformation about what an investment in supportive housing would do to the neighborhood. And I had a couple of pieces of information around that particular project, and it was pretty vociferous, and it carried over into Richmond as well. And it was, I think, seen. It was a political opportunist that sort of drove it at the time. So I have two stories about what happened. And so my dad was living around not far from there, and he was away for part of the year, and I came back, and he knew about the project. He'd heard about it. It was all over the news. And when he came back, he called me and said, "Selena, like, I just went for a walk in the neighborhood, and I expected to see cranes and, activity to see that homeless, shelter thing that you were building." Dad, you got to pay attention. It's called supportive housing. It's not a shelter. But I had to, remind him about what I was doing. And he said, "Well, I couldn't find it." I said, "Dad, it opened a month ago. People are living there. And if you couldn't tell which building it was, then we've done our job well." So he had no idea where it was. And we also got some really good stats that the crime rate in the neighborhood went down once we housed people. So that's been really helpful. And when I got the job, there hadn't really been a tracking of data. And so we really are implementing ways to track what happens in neighborhoods when we put these kinds of investments in so that we can push back on the NIMBY. I have to give hats off to Vancouver, because they really have stepped up in a big way. 606 homes now exist for people who are formerly homeless. I heard from the mayor who said, "Give us 600 more," and I said, "Well, there's lots of people who want that," and so we'll certainly, I know, continue to work with Vancouver. But we're still struggling, for example, in Maple Ridge. It's something that I've been paying close attention to over the last couple of weeks. It's been a hard couple of weeks. But we just opened one in Chilliwack, and Mayor Popov, who would never be in this room, I don't think, for a second, he came up to me and said, "You're doing the right thing. This is the right thing. It's making a difference." Chilliwack is thrilled. We're opening up another one in Chilliwack. The mayor of Abbotsford is another one who has said, "Thank you. This is great." Another two projects. So we are seeing from people who we wouldn't ever see in this room, who are saying this is the right thing, and they're grateful that we're doing it. But they too struggle with the NIMBY component, and it's work that I think we all need to be doing and addressing and challenging at every opportunity.
Thank you. Lots of questions from the audience about housing co-ops, so I'll give the next question to Tom here. How can we maintain existing units of co-op housing and develop more co-ops that have below market housing fees? What's needed for that?
Well, it's a, believe it or not, that's a touchy question in my own sector, because there's lots to love about housing co-ops. The communities that develop in those, among those members. But the thing that makes a lot of investors and funders nervous about co-ops is the sometimes erratic long-term asset management that arises from the volunteer-led governance model, and that's a fair conversation for people to raise. And the best way that we've developed to protect those homes and to make sure they're well managed and well maintained over time is to vest them in a community land trust. I hate to keep coming back to that theme, but that means you can divide up the responsibilities for long-term management in a way that reflects people's core strengths. So if co-ops keep doing what they do best, which is creating strong, diverse, supportive communities, and the land trust framework within which they're housed is responsible for the long-term asset management, then you can produce housing that is stewarded not just for this generation of co-op members, but the next generation and the one after that and the one after that. So that's a way to, I think, stabilize the model so that you can start from the base of co-ops that exist now, because most of them were developed between 1972 and 1991 under federal co-op housing programs. And many of those sites they were built to the density that was allowed at the time, but now you would consider them to be very low density, underutilized sites. But the buildings are also in many cases coming to the end of their useful lives. So that's a stock of land. If we do want to meet the aggressive targets we've set for ourselves around the generation of new supply, we can't just rely on bare land or newly acquired land to get to those goals. We have to use the land in the communities that we have now. So redeveloping those co-ops and those nonprofit housing providers in a way that respects the independence, the autonomy of the communities, and creates real partnerships, not top-down relationships between government and the community housing sector. That's the way to, in some cases, double, triple, quadruple the housing that exists now in the sector. And the last point I'll make is it's housing that's also the right kind of supply, is a term that we've learned to use. I have the privilege of sitting on the mayor's task force on community housing in Burnaby, and I can tell you there's been a sea change in Burnaby around the desire to lead the way in new housing policy. And the co-op housing stock in Burnaby alone represents a third of the rental homes that are 3 bedrooms and larger. So that stock of family size housing is frequently found in the co-op and the nonprofit housing sectors. And if we don't pay attention to that stock and learn how to regenerate it in the context of partnerships with municipalities and senior levels of government, then we'll not only risk the losing supply of very important affordable housing, but the right size of housing as well. And the last point I'll make, is because it's a pet peeve of mine, it's also, for the most part, pet-friendly housing. And that's something that I would urge everyone to have a strong look at. The SPCA in Vancouver alone last year euthanized more than 2,000 pets who belonged to renters who couldn't find a landlord willing to accept their application for a tenancy. And to me, that's a mental health issue that needs to be addressed by everyone in this room.
Also, a pet peeve. Councillor Boyle had talked a lot about renters' protections and the crisis facing renters in the province. I wanted to ask first the other two municipal governance people about this question from the audience along that line. So what ways can you work to keep people housed? Is it a question of rent control? Is it a question of displacement policies? Is it a question of first right of return? What are some of the ways that you can actually cap that to keep rents from going up as people are evicted, or from overall the stock increasing in price?
Well, it's interesting that the two local governments that are actually engaging in an aggressive rent eviction policy are here today, and hopefully other people will come and share what we're doing. One of the primary cause of the rent increases that I see in our city is speculators coming in, and they're looking at these 3-story walk-ups, which we have a large proportion of, and most of them were owned by long-term people in the community that become your good landlord that provides a good, safe place to live. They don't have it in them to gouge the tenants that have been paying their mortgage for 30 years during some really tough economic times. They're not going to now turn around and abuse them, but they are getting old, and they sell them. And they sell them to people that come in clearly looking at the books, and they say, wow, these people are paying $800 a month to $1,100 a month. I can triple that. And so what they do is they literally go in there and they buy them at sometimes over market value. They immediately start the rent eviction process. And once they're completed, they can actually recapitalize that building and borrow off it and buy another building, because they're now bringing in that much revenue. And a couple of the same players are doing that. They're recapitalizing their building and rent evicting other people. So to bring in really aggressive rent eviction policies, to make them accountable, to fine them significantly if they say they're rent evicting because of a patio door and somebody actually took that bait and left. We can come back in there and fine them. And the province has actually brought in some policy as well with the 4-month notice and the right to first refusal. And so it really takes educating the tenants and letting them know, bringing in the policies, educating the tenants and let them know that they do have rights, and then stand up strong against people that try to abuse those rights.
Great. Last question will be going to Mayor West.
I think, obviously, we've done the rent eviction bylaw, spoke of that, but for those of us who are on city councils, understanding the power that you have at the point of rezoning applications as well, there's really, I've always said to our staff, nothing's off the table. This is a negotiation. They have something they want, we have something we want. And so I can tell you, I had a very interesting conversation with Ani Development. And Ani is a very big developer, and I think we all know him. So they came to Port Coquitlam, they have a development, and they said, well, really, we need some additional density here. And again, I'm tying this back to understanding the value of density. And we said, okay, sure, we can, it's a suitable site for additional density, it's close to a frequent transit network, makes sense. You're going to get your additional density, and a percentage of that additional density you're going to provide to a nonprofit in our community of our choosing, and they're going to manage a percentage of those units for non-market rental housing. And you know what? They caved. Eventually they caved, and trust me, if you can get Ani, who builds these luxury market condos, to agree to that in small old Port Coquitlam, then you can do it all over the region. But again, you have to be able to sit across the table from these people and look them in the whites of their eyes and negotiate with them. They have something they want, and you have it. Don't give it away for nothing. Don't give it away just because density is a good planning principle.
All right. Well, I wanted to thank the panelists. We're out of time, but thank you, Tom, Selena, Chuck, Christine, and Brad. And thanks for your questions. Let's hear a round of applause for these experts here.
I also want to thank you for your presentation. It was totally boring. Nobody had any interesting questions. In fact, we have, I don't know how many questions that are sitting piled up over here from people here in the audience who really want to ask you many more questions. We will not throw those questions out. We're going to take them, we'll collate them, and we will send them to the panelists. And hopefully, if they have time, they'll be able to respond, and we'll post those responses. So we're not going to lose them. Obviously, this was as we saw from the polling, very important issue. Lots of really interesting things happening. I remember I lived in the golden age when the feds were still involved, and I was chair of Van City. And one of the areas that you can look for contribution of land is to socially responsible institutions. With Van City, we had a branch that we were tearing down. We wanted to build a new branch. It was too old. And when we were done, we had a single mother's place built right on top of the branch with the help of CMHC. So if they do come back, there's real opportunities. So I would just encourage you to think beyond just the developers. There are lots of people out there who have extra land who are willing to help build. So congratulations. Thank you. And if you'll file off this way, I will give you your honey jar.